Assalamu alaikum, good evening everyone, and Ramadan Kareem. Welcome to today's Ramadan Pioneer Series session, shifting the notion of museum from the past to the future. My name is Maitha, and I'm an Associate Project Manager at the Museum of Future, which is an initiative by the Future Foundation, and it's my absolute pleasure to be the moderator of today's session. So the agenda for today's session is as following. We'll start by an introduction about the Future Foundation by our colleague Majid Mansouri, and then a 15 to 20 minutes presentation by our speaker, Lāth Carlson, and then we'll have a Q&A session by the end of the session. So please feel free to ask any question at the Q&A section down below the screen or your phone or your laptop. So at the beginning, I would like to introduce our colleague Majid Mansouri. He's the acting head of project management at the Museum of the Future. Welcome, Majid.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Majid Mansouri, and I'm the acting head of the project management office at the Museum of the Future. I'll be taking you through a journey about the Dubai Future Foundation, and that journey started at the World Government Summit, when His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum asked to present some views of the future in different fields in a form of an immersive temporary exhibition, an exhibition that transports people into the future. The Dubai Future Foundation was subsequently formed as a manifestation of His Highness's vision to institutionalize future shaping. Since its inception, the foundation focused on developing multiple futuristic initiatives that embodied three pillars: the imagining the future, designing the future, and executing the future. These pillars were inspired by His Highness Sheikh Mohammed's quote, which says, "The future belongs to those who can imagine it, design it, and execute it." Over the course of a few years, DFF has started more than 15 initiatives that are split into 5 strategic business units, or what we call them internally SBUs. The first SBU is focused on imagining and understanding the future. This is where we have our research units and affiliates such as the Center for Fourth Industrial Revolution with our partner, the World Economic Forum, and the Dubai Future Research. Most recently, the Dubai Future Research have launched a few reports on life after COVID-19 and would encourage all of you to view the research papers. The second SBU disseminates future knowledge to the public through written and visual communications. Some of the initiatives that we have are the Dubai Future Talks and the Marsad al-Mustaqbal, amongst others in that SBU. The third SBU is DFF's focus on building future capacity, but also equipping people with skills of future. This is done through the Dubai Future Academy, the 1 Million Arab Coders, and the Global Coders Initiative. To design and accelerate the future, the Dubai Future Accelerators, the Area 2071, 10X, Palmwood, and the Dubai Future Labs, whom are doing extensive efforts in these challenging times, are all part of the 4th strategic business unit. And last but not least, the 5th strategic business unit is focused on getting the public to see and experience the future like never before through the Museum of the Future. Now, all of these initiatives would not be successful if we were not to implement these future strategies. The Dubai Future Foundation works very closely with government entities in Dubai, such as the Executive Council, on implementing strategies. To that point, I'm pleased to welcome my colleague Lāth Carlson, who will be taking you through a journey of the Museum of the Future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Majid, for the insights. And next, please allow me to introduce our speaker of today's session, Mr. Lāth Carlson, who will take us on a journey to explore how museums have evolved over time and where it might be going in the future, as well as he will give us a glimpse of how the Museum of the Future is set to allow its visitor to see, feel, and experience the future now. Lāth Carlson has over 30 years of experience of working with museums, and he's the current executive director of the Museum of the Future. And prior to joining the Museum of the Future, Lāth was the first director and CEO of the Living Computers Museum and Labs in Seattle. He previously transformed the Tech Museum of Innovation in California into a community resource for innovation through a facilitated museum and experience and useful spaces. So welcome, Lāth, and the mic is yours.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Ramadan Kareem. Very happy to be with you this morning. I'm going to be running through a little bit of the background of how museums have evolved over time, and then where we're headed in the future. And particularly, I've adapted this talk a little to the current situation. Obviously, as museums around the world are currently mostly closed, and really thinking about how they might reopen and how they might need to serve the public differently after reopening. I'll be touching on some of those themes as well, and what we're doing as the Museum of the Future to prepare for our opening. So with that, I'm going to switch now to sharing my screen so we can all see the same thing. When was the last time you saw a hopeful vision of the future? Particularly in these times, we're inundated with visions of less hopeful potential futures. We see this in films, we see this in shows, we see this all around us in the media. We see less hopeful visions of the future. But is there a place that you've been or something that you've seen that's shown you a hopeful vision of the future? It's my feeling that museums can be one of those places. Particularly now in this time of a global pandemic, people are really hungry for hope. They're hungry to see examples of things that are working, of a future that's more desirable maybe than even what we have now. And I think that's one of the unique opportunities of an event like this that's truly global in scale, is not only can we reevaluate some things in our own lives, but we can also think differently about our institutions, think differently about our communities, think differently how we might live. I've particularly been struck by the images around the world of clear skies over cities that are normally quite polluted, and wildlife returning to streets, and people out and being in nature more, and realizing that maybe when you don't spend hours a day commuting by car, that your life can be more positive and you have more opportunity to spend time with your families, for instance. So I think there's some interesting opportunities afforded by the current situation, and I think museums certainly can play a fairly important role in that as we move forward. But first, I think it's nice to give some context about how museums have evolved. Usually, when you say the word museum, people instantly think of an art museum, although there are actually far more non-art museums in the world than there are art museums. And museums initially were developed to be much more multidisciplinary than what they've ended up being in many cases. We'll be evolving in the course of this discussion from the idea of museums that exhibit the past and seek to inspire people by arts and sciences and discoveries of the past, to the museums that we might have in the future that are really focused on how we might live differently in the future, how we might take advantage of human creativity to develop more positive and optimistic future worlds, rather than just looking backwards to the past. The very first museums were not even called museums. They were called cabinets of curiosity. And this is an example of one of them here from the 1690s. And what these were fairly educated people from around the world who would collect different objects. They would collect fine art, they would collect natural history specimens, they would collect things from other cultures, and they would put them together in these cabinets, and people would come to explore them and to see sort of the wonders of the world in its breadth. So they were not, about one particular topic. They were quite broad in their approach, but they also didn't really apply any rigor to the collection. It was just a mishmash of all the interesting things that a person had found and collected over time. But it was a way for people to see a broader world than they might experience in their villages or cities in a time when global travel was unlikely for most people. And that's really where we started. It was with these just collections that a lot of times individuals had put together, some of which then grew in such a scope that they became whole buildings. And when they became a whole building, we started calling them a museum. Those museums were often run by those individuals, but often you saw different civic institutions and other groups coming together to build museums. And often these museums were similarly a collection of things that had been put together, but they were more now grouped by topic. For instance, this is an early natural history museum showing all the different skeletons and natural history collections, but often they still just had a small label maybe that went along with them and maybe some sort of grouping, but really it was just a place that people could come and see the wonders of the world, but without much context, without a lot of really learning happening. They did sometimes host talks, actually quite like this one that I'm doing right now, and sometimes would host live demonstrations of different scientific phenomena in particular. This all really started to shift in 1969. So in 1969, a couple really important things happened in the museum world. The first was that the Exploratorium in San Francisco opened. When the Exploratorium opened, it was very unique. It was opened as an experiment in how interactive experiences might better help people understand scientific phenomena. And it was put together in a very sort of rudimentary way with just plywood and found kind of materials hacked together into these demonstrations of different forces in nature and in the world. And what was unique about it is that it was a museum without any artifacts. So it was truly a museum just of experiences and just of interacting with phenomena. And around the same time that this happened, Michael Spock at the Children's Museum in Boston also started implementing hands-on activities in the museum. And I think for a lot of people, that might be a shocking idea that before that, even children's museums did not allow you to touch things. They were still static collections of objects for the most part. So it was very recently in the late 1960s and early 1970s that we started to get this idea of, well, maybe hands-on experiences would be a good way for children to learn, but also for adults as well. And what followed this into the 1980s and 1990s was this absolute explosion across the world of children's museums and particularly science centers being built in countries across the world, and they continue to be built in many countries now. And the emphasis there was much more on this interaction with the phenomena, the interaction with the materials. You still might have objects and displays and artifacts, but it was really a focus on the learning that might happen in the institution, as opposed to just going to see something that was interesting or cool. So it was very much a shift in the way we thought about museums, and many art museums and history museums followed suit, and they started implementing these more hands-on activities, interactive elements into the museum experience, to the point where now we often take that for granted as we view mostly non-art museums. We expect to have some level of interactivity, some level of engagement with the topic that's beyond just a small label, for instance. And in these experiences, as I mentioned, they're very much about learning. So the approach is that the museum has this knowledge, they have these artifacts, they have these objects, and they would like you to learn about them. And that's what we consider the instructionalist approach, the museum as instructor, almost like in a university setting or in a school setting where you have an instructor up in front of a classroom imparting their knowledge on the students. That's the mode of interaction that most of these museums took, even if they were interactive. And this is what we label as Museums 1.0. This is sort of the first generation of museums, the first 100 years or so of museums really took that approach of these learning institutions. They were there to impart their hard-won knowledge onto the visitor. There was not a lot of opportunity for the visitor to share their experiences, share what they felt about these things, share their life experience with the institution. It was very much an absorb from the institution model. And this has only very recently started to change. Over the last 10 years or so, a movement started called Museums 2.0. This was really brought about by Nina Simon, who had actually worked with some of my previous institutions, writing a blog and then a book called The Participatory Museum, her blog Museums 2.0, which is now actually being run by another friend of mine, Seema Rao, is now running that project. But that was this idea that could museums be more participatory, looking at what happened with Web 2.0, for those that remember that transition of the web going also from a person putting up a website, people then just reading it and absorbing that information, to the rise of things like YouTube and like social media and Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and all these things that allow for a two-way dialogue. That really got her thinking about how could a museum engage more in that kind of a dialogue. And what that's resulted in is you'll now see in many exhibitions, particularly in children's museums and science centers, but also in history museums and art museums, you will see these opportunities for you to engage in a dialogue with the institution. So in this example on the screen, in a children's museum where people are leaving their messages about their family and what family means to them and engaging in a dialogue with the content of the exhibition. You're also seeing with this movement a lot more emphasis on community-oriented programming and directly engaging with the community and doing it much more in a dialogue. And what this has done is it increases people's personal interaction with the institution and their connection with the institution and its content. And the other interesting side effect maybe of this is that now museums' institutional dominance of a topic has been eroded. So now you have things like a group called Museum Hack that gives basically unsanctioned tours of art museums, for instance. So they'll come in and they'll give their own interpretation of the art museum. You have people actually doing podcasts that are essentially audio tours of museums, once again, unsanctioned by those museums. So you're adding the opportunity for more narratives to come in, more points of view to be applied to the museum experience. And it has really shifted, I think, the way many museums think, particularly about how they serve their communities, how they engage with the individuals coming to the museum. And in that, you've seen an adoption of the term guest rather than visitor. So in a 1.0 museum, you tend to have people visit the museum, whereas in a 2.0 museum, you tend to treat the people that come more as a guest, somebody that you would engage in a dialogue with, that you would have more of a personal relationship with, and that you would take care of in some way. And my own personal work over the last 8 years or so has really been about how might we expand beyond 2.0 to 3.0. 3.0 being how might we go beyond the dialogue and actually take it to a point of co-creation and take it to a point of collaboration with the people coming to the museum. I've been termed this museum as resource or the useful museum. The idea that a museum is a place that people come and use, much like you might use a library or you might use a park. And it's always struck me as slightly odd that we talk about using libraries, we talk about using parks, but we often will say we visit a museum. Why don't we use a museum? And so that would be the mode of interaction here would be as users. So not as visitors, not as guests, but transforming people into users. This is something that I did quite extensively at the Tech Museum of Innovation in Silicon Valley, now actually just called the Tech Interactive. They've dropped the name museum from their name because they really view it as a different type of entity than a traditional museum, because it is this place of collaboration and co-creation. The image here is of one of the actually the first space that we opened when I was at the Tech, called Tech Studio, which is a makerspace and fab lab that visitors come in and work on their own projects and their own creations, as well as being exposed to things like 3D printers and CNC machines and things that they can use to create these fantastic projects. And what's really important, I think, about those projects is it gives people an opportunity to use real tools and materials to create things that are personally relevant and meaningful to them, and to build their skill set so that it empowers them. This is an image from my last museum, the Living Computers Museum and Labs in Seattle, Washington, where we had extensive spaces where people could come in and learn things like soldering. So in this case, this user is coming in and learning how to solder circuit boards and make his own projects. And this is something we did for you were, where you came from, what your background was. It was really about empowering all people to use these tools and technologies to better themselves and their skills, and also to build projects that could be meaningful to them and potentially meaningful to the world. And that's now taken off, I think, across many science centers in particular, but all kinds of museums that are now offering, everything from skill building workshops and different types of lectures, but also getting involved in community projects. Right now, there are particularly science centers and children's museums across the world that are building PPE for healthcare workers. So there's many of them are using their 3D printers, using their other materials. At the Tech, we actually had a full biology wet lab that we ran with Stanford University And so there was a whole bunch of materials that were available to donate to various healthcare organizations. So really taking an active role in helping communities and using the technologies that these museums have to broadly impact others, which is a great realization, of this role of being a resource to the community, of offering real tools and materials. And philosophically, if we look at learning theory and what's the background of these movements, it really does mirror the evolution of learning theory from instructionalist approaches, like I talked about, to in the Museum 2.0 and the Science Center movement, constructivist learning styles, and then constructionalist learning, which is constructionist learning is when learning by doing, learning by making something. Seymour Papert at MIT was one of the great proponents of this way of learning. And that's really what you see in these maker spaces and these labs that are in many museums. And of course, the question becomes, what comes after 3.0? Obviously, we could just say 4.0, but what would 4.0 be? And this is what a lot of us have been thinking about for the last 4 or 5 years is, what does the world need from our museums now? What are the new opportunities? And prior to this, unprecedented event that we're in the midst of now, many of us were already thinking about this and thinking about, what comes after those learning approaches, what comes after those types of museums, and thinking about the practices of futurism in particular. When I worked in Silicon Valley, I was first exposed to the Institute for the Future, which is an organization very similar to Dubai Future Foundation. And what IEFTF does is do these scenario planning and uses futures thinking to think about possible scenarios for the future, and using those scenario planning as a tool to help people think about how they might get involved and actually realize those optimistic and possible futures, which is very much what Dubai Future Foundation does as well. And so, and around the world, there's a growing movement to develop what we call future-oriented museums. There's a group of us that have now gotten together once personally in Amsterdam, and then again virtually just a couple of weeks ago, that are truly from around the world. We're all looking at this of how we might build museums that can respond to these global issues, that can do it in an optimistic way, that can use the tools of futurism to provide a new experience in the museum space. And what's fascinating about Dubai Future Foundation is that they're way ahead and have been doing this now for a number of years. So back about 6 years ago, I guess now, they started doing these pop-up museum experiences coordinated with the World Government Summit. And each year a different theme was chosen. This is an image from the Humans 2.0 theme. And within that theme created a immersive environment that guests could come into and really experience what an optimistic future might look like around a particular subject. And that was a really powerful experience for the attendees. And it really spurred Dubai Future Foundation and the government of Dubai to think about how they might bring that experience to a wider audience. And that's truly the genesis of the Museum of the Future, is how might these pop-up museum experiences become a permanent place that's much more broadly accessible to the population of Dubai and the UAE, but also globally, so people can see how powerful this experience can be of immersing yourself in a possible future. And it really plays to the strengths of what museums have done for many years, which is to become really effective storytellers. What's unique about a museum environment is you can tell a story in every mode and every sense available. So you can completely surround people not only with the visual elements, but with sounds, with smells, with textures, with so many tactile experiences, so many immersive elements that really make the space come to life. And once again, I think that this has been brought home by the current crisis. You're seeing people see, the pollution lift in the cities, seeing these cities where they've closed streets so that people can ride their bikes and run and play on the streets, and people being very positive about that experience, which advocates of open streets and advocates for clean air and things have been working for decades to try to communicate how much better things might be if we made those changes, but it didn't really come home to people until they directly experienced it themselves. And you're seeing that now, and I hope the momentum of that really stays, and that these, when we see the skies clearing over cities in India or in LA and these places, that we maybe act to keep it that way, and to make those changes more permanent. And I think that that's the power of this immersive storytelling that museums can do. And that's really the core of what museums are, is they are physical spaces. Museums are not websites, they're not films, they're not TikTok. They may engage in all those mediums, but that's not fundamentally what makes the museum. What makes the museum is the physical space. There's a very interesting study that was just done about when this pandemic hit and everyone was staying at home and all the museums were shut down, museums often pivoted to online tours. The data from that shows that people were interested for exactly 4 days in online tours. There was a very brief peak of people going, okay, yeah, I'm home, maybe I'll check out this museum online. But then ultimately the experience is just not nearly as satisfying. And part of the reason for that is that going to the museum is actually quite a social experience. And it's one that surrounds you with other people, with the physical environment, with sometimes, fantastic architecture, with incredible exhibitions and art. You just can't replicate that experience on a website. It really is important that they're physical spaces. In particular, when you're trying to communicate an optimistic possible future, if you can't really bring people into that in a way that feels real, it's not going to have the same traction. Seeing a film that's optimistic is not nearly as empowering as living in a space that inherently feels optimistic and possible. And this is one of the things I worry about in the current situation, is the social aspect of museums. It's a critical piece of it. The joke I often tell is the only people that go to museums alone are museum professionals. And if you think about it, that's usually true. If you go to a museum and you look around, it's almost always people in family groups, it's school groups, it's friends going together. It's not just people going usually by themselves. And part of the fun of going to a museum is sharing the experiences, sharing what you're seeing, sharing what you're experiencing. So we want to keep that intact in some way. And particularly when we're talking about future-oriented museums, so much of it is having people come to the realization that by working together, they can realize these optimistic futures. And it really does require working together. And that's something we're seeing also in this pandemic, is the amount of selfless, interaction that people are having with their neighbors, with their communities, and really helping out in ways that are really inspiring to see. And you're seeing that around the world. How do we continue that momentum once again in acting together to make these futures possible? And finally, an attribute of museums that most people may be unaware of is how trusted museums are. Museums do engage in a lot of scholarship. Many museums have tens, if not hundreds, of scientists on staff working on everything from what you might expect as in paleontology, for instance, or anthropology, but also in learning theory, and in economic systems, and in all kinds of areas that they're doing research. And that's what grounds what we do for the public. So everything we present to the public is grounded in facts, it's grounded in data, it's grounded in science. And studies have been done to look at what are the most trusted institutions in most countries, and museums always come out as the most trusted institution. Trusted more certainly than politicians, trusted more than business people, trusted more than mainstream media, the most trusted source of accurate information. And I think that's really important when we're talking about very big issues that are out there in the world, like climate change, for instance. It's important that museums can present that authoritative voice that's based in science, but also have that opportunity for the Museum 2.0 dialogue and for the Museum 3.0, engaging people in maybe solving those problems, and the Museum 4.0 envisioning these possible futures that are better than what we've been living in. So that's really how I see the museums playing to the current situation, but in general, playing to their strengths of being these places of optimism, these places of social interaction with stories that are really important to us, that people can explore and be inspired for what might come in the future, rather than museums of the past that have been so focused on inspirational stories from the past and inspirational art from the past, but really flipping that and going, well, how do we push that forward? How do we look, to the forward into the future? And for us at Dubai Future Foundation and Museum of the Future team and all of our partners in collab, we might live differently in the future. Generally, the arc of the journey in the museum will be taking people from outer space to inner space, and what's in between, obviously. And so the museum itself is built on the notion of this earthen mound at the bottom that does represent the earth. The physical structure of the museum is representing human creativity and innovation, and inscribed with these incredible calligraphy and quotes from His Highness Sheikh Mohammed. And then the hole through the middle represents the unknowable future, or what we don't know and might come. So it's this kind of sense of possibility. It's a sense of where we might be headed. In that space, there we go. In that space, like I said, we'll be taking people on this journey from outer space to inner space, and so people will start farthest from where we are now. Starting in outer space, we'll take people on a quite believable journey into a near Earth orbit space station, and exploring how the potential for sustainable energy from space might be transmitted to Earth and really solve the global energy needs, and what might happen if we were able to achieve that, what that might mean for cooperation amongst nations, about equality amongst people and equitable resource distribution, and how we might live more sustainably in so many different ways. So by putting people in this environment, we really hope to inspire them with those possibilities, and obviously do this, as you can see, in a social space as well, in a space that is in dialogue, a space that's actually facilitated by trained staff, directly facilitated experiences in that space. From outer space, we'll take you down more to the level of the Earth, and really exploring how we might use technologies like AI and genetic engineering to repair damaged ecosystems. The focus of this floor will be entirely on the effects of climate change in the future and how we will need to mitigate that, and the technologies we might deploy, but also the group effort that it will require to make those repairs, and how we might do that, and also, frankly, how hard that's going to be. We're not going to shy away from the real science and the data that shows this is not easy stuff to do. This is actually quite difficult to repair these things. This is hard work, and it requires a lot of effort. But there is incredible potential there, and we can see how we can make some significant changes. And I think, once again, quite inspired by what we're seeing right now during this pandemic of wildlife returning from places that it had not been for some time, and seeing kind of rivers clearing up, skies clearing, and seeing how that change actually might happen. And from there, we'll take visitors back into themselves. So if we started in outer space, we want to end with the human body, and with inner space as well, with our well-being in very broad terms. So looking at how we might reconnect people with their senses, but also reconnect them with each other and with their community. Once again, something that's, I think, been really powerful about this moment is how many of us have spent so much more time with our families, sometimes maybe a little too much time with our families, but clearly, there's an opportunity here to engage more directly with our families, with each other, to think about our senses beyond just what we engage with the screen. So many of us are spending so much time on screens, particularly now. How do we step away with that and re-engage with our bodies, with our senses, but also even with our spirituality as well? And that's something we'll dive into in the museum. So it's a very broad, comprehensive look at everything from what's going on within ourselves, in our minds, in our spirit, all the way out to how we engage in the world, and then how we might engage in worlds actually beyond the Earth. So that's generally, what we'll be tackling in the museum when we open. We're working with incredible partners around the world to realize these experiences. So this is not something that's done just by the DFF team and just by the museum team. We're working with artists and designers and futurists truly globally on this project to bring this to Dubai and to the world from there. And with that, I will hand it back to Maitha. Maybe we can talk about some questions and engage with the audience as well.
Thank you so much for the great presentation. Like, it's really amazing to see how museum actually has evolved over the time from being just a body or an institute, kind of a solid one, to a more interactive one, to museum 4.0. So I think we'll start with the questions right away, and I encourage everyone to ask the questions. So I guess the most important question now is, when is actually the opening of the museum? People are excited to know that.
Yes, asking the hardest question first, I see. So, just like globally, a lot of things that had been planned, Expo 2020, for instance, and the Olympics, and so many things that have had so much planning go into so much excitement for them to happen. And now with the current, crisis, a lot of those things needing to reevaluate. Obviously, for all of us, the safety of our staffs, of our, the health of our communities, are the most important thing. And we've been quite fortunate on our team to have, no one directly affected yet by the pandemic, but we are anticipating, those impacts will come. Certainly, we are monitoring the situation very closely, and right now we are planning on delaying our opening from 2020. We're looking at, possibly aligning with Expo, which had been our intention previously. So we had intended to open prior to Expo 2020. Now with Expo moving back nearly a year, might we, align in a similar way? That's something we're certainly considering, but we have not made any final decisions. We're really queuing off of what's going on globally and how other institutions are handling the situation.
All right. So the next question is, what was the inspiration and history behind the Museum of the Future?
So I touched a bit on the pop-ups that have been done as part of World Government Summit, and that really was the genesis of the museum, was the success of those. Those were primarily targeted at government officials, diplomats, very influential people from around the world. So it was quite a limited audience, but even within that audience of people that had worked in these fields for quite some time, they had never been in a space that really brought home the potential of some of these technologies, of some of these innovations and changes, until they went into those immersive spaces and saw this kind of fully realized immersive future that they could inhabit and experience together. And in that space, what I've heard is that often these people would come in, they would see that, and then they would start a dialogue that was much more energetic, much more optimistic, much more engaged than maybe they would do if they were just on a panel discussion or in some other format. And so that really inspired leadership to look at that and go, well, this is something maybe we should do more broadly. I really give a lot of credit to His Highness Sheikh Mohammed and to Dubai government and to everyone that's been behind this project, because it is quite a significant investment to build something like this and to bring it to life. But it's absolutely, a incredible opportunity, incredible thing to do. And now we're seeing other places around the world actually looking at building similar versions of it themselves, because they see the value of the concept and the idea.
So as you mentioned earlier also, that the museum have evolved actually over time to become a place for people to engage and learn and to be inspired, rather just of having a place to visit. So in your opinion, what are the, let's say, 5 to 3 methods that could help people to engage the community and public into the museum and make them feel like they are actually part of that institute?
I think that the big change that we've seen is the idea of going beyond the visit. So traditionally, museums have been these places that people visit, and that's kind of it. The one anecdote that we use a lot in museums is that most people come twice. They come when they're a kid, and then they come when they have kids. And that's usually about the extent of it. What we've really seen is this shift from the single visit type of engagement to bringing many more opportunities to people. So whether they be classes that they can take at the museum, whether they be lectures, whether they be online learning resources, workshops, teacher training classes, there's a whole breadth of things that now that museums offer that really encourage people to engage in multiple ways at different times. And with Museum of the Future, frankly, we're incredibly lucky because we have everything that Dubai Future Foundation does that we can connect into. So we have this great opportunity. If someone comes to the museum and is inspired, we can then directly connect them, say, to something that's happening at Dubai Future Academy, or something that's happening, with Dubai's Future Accelerators, or any other aspect of Dubai Future Foundation. So there's that direct connection for them to get more deeply involved and engaged in various ways based on what's interesting to them.
Okay, so we've received many questions. It's about the future generation, and how would the Museum of the Future help in equipping the future generations with skills and education? Another related question is, how can we integrate museums more into school life and to inspire beyond the constraints of learning and exams?
So one thing I did not mention is we do have planned an entire floor of the museum directed at children. And it's a similar future-oriented space, but it's a space in which we're asking children to take the role of, as we're calling them, future heroes. And they can go on missions and solve challenges, and really taking the best of video games and incorporating that into a physical space. And we're probably most excited almost about that space. It's been the hardest to develop, but in the end, what we've come up with is really unique and an incredible space. I have a 7-year-old daughter myself, and she can't wait to come visit the space. She keeps asking me about when it's going to be done. So she doesn't have maybe the patience that I do for these things. So we do have a space that is dedicated to that, and the entire space is actually built on the idea of 21st century skills, and the idea that going into the future for our children, the most important things are actually the soft skill development of how to collaborate together, how to work with emotional intelligence, how to be a problem solver, how to persevere through failure. So a lot of these traits that are, have come out of a lot of research into, what does make somebody adaptable and agile as a thinker and as a doer, because in the future, they often say most of the jobs that our kids will have don't exist yet. So, the idea of kind of training people for factory work or things just doesn't make any sense anymore. So our education is being transformed. We're also aligning that space completely with the educational initiatives within Dubai, what are being rolled out within the schools, and aligning with that and creating a space where teachers can bring their class to this space, and it's aligned with what they're doing back in the classroom, but just with an added level of immersion, an added level of richness to it, and a level of excitement that's hard to replicate, I would say, in the classroom.
So there's a space also for families as well.
Yes, absolutely.
So how can the Museum of the Future create a kind of a welcoming and a psychological safe place for people to come in and interact and feel safe to engage and experiment their ideas and thoughts, instead of being intimidated by the iconic architecture?
That's a really important question. And a lot of my work actually over the last 10 years or so has been on this, on how do you make museums more broadly accessible to all people. I came from a background, where personally growing up, I didn't actually visit museums. I grew up in a rural place where there just weren't museums, and that just wasn't culturally a thing that we did. And looking at it, in the United States, for instance, fully 2/3 of the population never visits a museum. And part of that is because they view museums as these kind of traditional structures that are quite imposing, big steps in the front and the marble columns and all of that. And it just doesn't feel like a place that's welcoming to them. I think it's really important for a museum, like Museum of the Future in a city like Dubai that doesn't have a strong culture of museums and museum going, to present ourselves as broadly accessible and as something that isn't intimidating, that is open to everyone, that is very easy to engage with. And we're really looking at doing that through all of our communication. So in the language that we use, being quite clear in our language and not trying to use lofty terms and things, and to be quite approachable in our language and in our visual style, in our accessibility when it comes to what languages we are accommodating. Obviously, English and Arabic are key, but also how can we accommodate hundreds of other languages potentially for visitors that are coming from everywhere around the world, and how do we create experiences that are kind of welcoming for everyone. And that's something I've been able to do quite successfully at other institutions. And I'm looking forward to bringing that to a place that is as international as Dubai.
Great. So also I saw many questions related to this question. So as we know that the content of mostly all of the museums around the world gain more value with time. And however, the case is actually the quite opposite with our museum, the Museum of the Future, where the content actually loses the value with time. So how we can actually maintain the content to be futuristic?
That's a great question, and it does come up quite often. And I think the most important way that we're answering that is not necessarily being a museum of technology first. We're truly a museum of people first, and human creativity, human ingenuity, human adaptability, human connection. What we can do collectively together is so much more powerful than what any single piece of technology might enable us to do. And I think once again, looking at the current crisis, you are seeing what can happen when people work collectively together and do something, as seemingly basic as just staying home, right? There's so much power we're learning in just, keeping ourselves at home and keeping ourselves isolated. That's not a technological solution. That's a very basic, human solution. And so when we're presenting these different futures, we're very much focused on the human elements of it. We certainly are talking about some of the potential technologies, but we're talking about them more broadly, not saying, this specific AI or this specific robot. We're saying, well, these are some ways that, artificial intelligence or robotics might apply to these challenges, but not locking ourselves into trying to predict the future. And I think that's the big misconception around the work of futurism and futurists is, we don't try to predict the future. What we try to do is look at trends, look at scenarios, and look at how we might live, but we don't try to lock ourselves in and say, no, it's going to be X, because frankly, if we tried to do that, if you look at Bill Gates, you look at other people who for 15 years have been predicting a global pandemic, none of them predicted what year it would happen. None of them predicted exactly how it would spread. None of them predicted, the specifics of the situation. And I'd say we're doing something similar, and we're looking broadly at, there are some very plausible scenarios talking about space. There's quite plausible scenarios about how we might harvest solar energy in space and transmit it to Earth. It's well-grounded science. How is that going to happen exactly as we're presenting it in the museum? We have no way of knowing, but it frankly doesn't really matter. It's that concept and the availability of that solution in general that's more important. So by focusing in those broad stories, not locking ourselves into predicting specific technology, and focusing very much on the human element of the future, that's, I think, how we keep ourselves from being dated and from feeling like it's something that's already passed. I joke with our colleagues in Brazil of the Museum of Tomorrow that it's much more difficult to be a museum of tomorrow than a museum of 50 years from now, right? Because everybody knows if you predict what's happening tomorrow and you get it wrong, just ask any weatherman, right? Any weather forecaster knows what that's like. I used to actually sit next to one at the Franklin Institute, and every day when his forecast that I would hear in the morning on the radio turned out to be wrong, I could rib him a little bit about that, right? If he was predicting what might happen with climate 50 years out, it's a little safer bet. So I think that that's also what we're doing, is we're looking more farther into the future. We're looking at around 2071 as opposed to what happens tomorrow or next week.
Okay, so how would it be different from any other museum in terms of visitor journey, for example?
I think that what's really unique about what we're doing is, once again, leveraging the experience from World Government Summits. And in those spaces, it was a museum exhibit in a sense, in that there were objects and artifacts and storytelling, but it was all done within a kind of in-world experience. And that's very much what we're creating within the Museum of the Future, is in-world experiences. So when you are on a space station, for instance, you really will feel like you were there, and you'll interact with the people that are working on the space station in 2071, fully, in costume, in role, with all the knowledge that they would have as somebody, from that time in the future. And that'll, be pervasive throughout the museum, is that sense that you're fully, within this believable future space, almost like we're walking onto a film set, but a film set that isn't just, a backdrop. It's a fully, it surrounds you on every side. So it's really a special, I think, experience in that regard. And it's actually quite a bit more like an immersive theater type experience, maybe, than a traditional museum exhibition. And so, we will be doing time ticketing, where people will need to arrive, for their show time, almost like you would if you're going to Dubai Opera, if you're going to, if you're going to see a film, for instance, at a movie theater, right? You come for the time of the film. So we'll be doing that as well. So we can really control the experience and have people have this amazing in-world experience throughout the immersive floors.
Great. So we have a question from Fatma Naimi. Would these museums include research center or hold archives that will be accessible for researchers?
The museum itself will not. And once again, this is the power of being connected to Dubai Future Foundation. So Dubai Future Foundation, does so much of that background research work and dissemination. And as Ahmad mentioned at the beginning, it's right now, even over the last, month, putting out these white papers and putting out this research on the post-COVID world. So there's so much available, through DFF that we don't feel as, it's our role as a museum to take, that on. And I would say that in museums, once again, taking the conversation more broadly to museums, I would say one of the failings of many museums is going too broad and trying to do too much. So you see a lot of museums where more than half of their staff are engaged in projects that have nothing to do with the public-facing aspects of the museum. For us, we're planning on being quite focused in what we do and creating the world's best museum experience, and not really going beyond that, really focused there, because we have organizations like DFF that are doing much more broad work than that.
Okay, so the next question is, sustainability is key focus today. What are you doing towards sustainability at the Museum of the Future?
We're quite fortunate. I mean, when the building itself was envisioned, and the architect, Sean Killa, and the engineering firm, Burr Happel, started working on it, sustainability was a key feature of the building itself. So it's envisioned to be a LEED Platinum certified building, which is the highest, standard of sustainable certification, the first LEED Platinum museum building in the Middle East when it's complete. And the building itself is quite remarkable in how it's dealing with energy use, water use, things of that nature, and how it connects into transportation. So we have, a bridge that's being built right now that connects the museum to the metro station, for instance. So we're directly connected to public transit, and as well as, having electric car charging stations, having solar arrays that are on the parking garage around Emirates Towers that actually feed the energy needs of the museum. Looking at what we do with our landscaping and water usage. So there's a lot of things built into the museum, but also even in how we operate, we're really looking at how we operate with the least possible environmental impact. And even to the point of our retail store will be featuring many items that are sustainably produced based on their material usage and processes to create them. So really carrying it through the operations. We've been exploring in our cafe and F&B spaces, we use alternative proteins, for instance, and eventually cultured meats and things like that are more sustainable from an environmental perspective.
Okay, so I saw many questions that's actually related to COVID-19, and I think I have to ask this question: how the Museum of the Future is responding to the post-pandemic future in terms of guest journey and space design?
It's something we're thinking about truly daily and looking at this. We're quite fortunate in some of the features that we had already built into the museum exhibit experience now adapt quite well to the current situation. And so the idea of time ticketing, that you have a time slot when you come, now museums around the world are adapting that philosophy to deal with spacing out visitor flow. So that's something we've already built into our plans on and how to do that. We've also, we do create these immersive experiences, but they can be done in a touchless way. So we're using various camera tracking technologies and other, ways of tracking people and and having them interact with things. So you can have this incredibly immersive, interactive experience without actually physically touching things. So we have some good opportunities like that. And actually, because the flow of the exhibitions is controlled, we know how many people come in every time interval, so we can enforce a degree of spacing, through that. So we're looking at all of those scenarios. Should the current conditions continue, we would still be able to operate at probably one of the safest spaces, within Dubai. Because we haven't opened yet, we have the opportunity to build in a lot of those features rather than having to retrofit like other attractions might have to do. So we are really looking at those opportunities to do that. I would say, the area that we find most challenging probably is our children's floor, because it's a very high touch space. So we're really looking at what our options there might be, if the current conditions do continue.
Okay. So I think we are almost at the end of our session. There's one last question. One message you would like to give to the viewers that they can expect from the Museum of the Future?
As my last slide said, I mean, it's a space that we really hope people are inspired by, but more importantly, they're inspired then to make those futures actually happen, and to understand that they are empowered to do that, and they can really tap into the resources that Dubai Future Foundation provides, as well as other organizations, to make those futures real. Because I truly believe, humans are the most creative and adaptable species ever, and we can overcome these challenges, and we can have an incredible future for all of humanity. And I really encourage us all to work towards that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lāth, and I think we've reached the end of the session. Thank you everyone for watching, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. Thank you, Majid, also for participating. I would like to thank also Dubai Future Academy team for organizing the seminar, and of course you can check their website for the upcoming sessions as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.